You know what's funny? The avoidant always thinks they're the one in control. They pull away, they create distance, they ration affection like it's a reward system. And for a while, it works. They get to decide when to connect, when to disappear, when to come back, just enough to keep you hooked. But here's the irony. The person they think they're controlling is usually the one who ends up controlling the outcome. Because one day that person wakes up. At first, the avoidant thrives in the power dynamic. They love mystery, they crave independence, and they believe that closeness threatens their freedom. They want love, but only in doses they can manage. They convince themselves that their detachment keeps them safe, but it doesn't, it keeps them lonely. They start seeing their partner's affection as pressure, their care as suffocation, their consistency as boredom. So they pull back just enough to keep emotional space between them and the person who actually wants to love them. But something happens in that space. The person who once tried so hard to prove their worth gets tired. They stop chasing clarity. They stop over-explaining, over-giving, over-functioning. They begin to realize that they've been loving someone who's terrified of being loved. And the second that realization lands, the power shifts. The avoidant feels it immediately. They sense the silence, the calm withdrawal, the absence of pursuit. Suddenly, the control they once had evaporates. And that's when panic sets in, because control was never real. It was a temporary illusion built on someone else's willingness to stay. When that willingness disappears, the avoidant meets their greatest fear. Abandonment, not by rejection, but by exhaustion. Here's the truth they don't tell you. The avoidant doesn't want to lose love. They just want to manage it. But love doesn't survive management. It survives vulnerability. It grows through mutual risk, through the uncomfortable truth of being seen, not through distance. And when you treat love like a threat, it eventually treats you like a stranger. So yes, the avoidance cycle always ends with the one they tried to control. Not because that person stopped caring, but because they finally remembered themselves. They stopped waiting for a half love to become whole. And the moment they walked away, they broke the avoidance illusion of power. If you've ever been that person, the one who stayed too long, explained too much, or tried to heal someone who wasn't ready, understand this, you didn't fail. You simply reached the end of someone else's cycle. You stopped spinning, and that's what freedom looks like. The avoidant might replay what happened in their mind, convincing themselves they didn't need you. But deep down, they know they lost the only person who ever tried to understand them. And that realization doesn't fade, it echoes. Because control doesn't keep people, it only delays their leaving. And love that's withheld will always lose to the love that learns to let go. Control is such a seductive illusion, it makes the avoidant feel powerful, detached, and safe. In the beginning, they believe they're the ones holding all the strings. They decide when to open up and when to pull away, when to respond and when to go silent. It gives them a sense of superiority, like they're above the messy emotions that everyone else drowns in. But what they don't see is that their control only exists because someone else is trying to hold the connection together. Control in this case is borrowed energy. It thrives only as long as the other person keeps reaching, apologizing, or trying to fix what's broken. When the avoidant pulls away, their partner often chases. That chase feeds the illusion of power. It tells the avoidant, I'm important enough to be pursued. But in truth, they're not being pursued for their worth. They're being pursued because the other person still believes there's something worth saving. It's not admiration they're receiving, it's compassion. Yet in the avoidant's mind, that compassion becomes confirmation of their dominance. They mistake care for control. They believe they can disappear and still be wanted, reject affection and still be loved, give crumbs and still be fed. But all illusions have an expiration date. One day, the person on the other end stops chasing. They get quiet, not out of punishment, but out of peace. They realize that love shouldn't feel like negotiation. And that's when the ground beneath the avoidance starts to shake. The power they once felt begins to dissolve, because their sense of control depended entirely on someone else's effort. The moment that effort fades, their dominance disappears. What they thought was control was really the absence of accountability, the avoidance of emotional honesty. The avoidant begins to notice subtle changes, no more anxious texts, no more questions, no more emotional intensity, just space. And for someone who has spent their life running from closeness, That space becomes unbearable. They thought they wanted freedom, but what they're left with is emptiness. The illusion of control crumbles because control without connection is meaningless. You can't feel powerful over someone who's already walked away. What the avoidant eventually learns, often too late, is that true control was never about withholding affection. It was about mastering fear. The ones who can face their vulnerability, who can sit with discomfort and still choose connection, are the ones who truly have emotional strength. The avoidance version of control is reactive, defensive, and fragile. It breaks the moment it's tested. Real control, if it even exists in love, is found in emotional self-awareness, in the ability to stay when it's easier to run, to listen when it's easier to withdraw. So when the avoidance cycle ends, it's not because their partner stopped caring. It's because the illusion finally broke. The person who once held them up stopped participating in the performance. And when that happens, the avoidant is left alone on stage, realizing the spotlight they thought they commanded was never really theirs to begin with. Distance often feels like safety to the avoidant. It's the place where they can breathe, where no one can demand too much or see too deeply. They build walls not because they don't crave love, but because they're terrified of losing themselves inside it. Every inch of closeness feels like a threat to their independence, so they retreat, emotionally, mentally, sometimes even physically. At first, that distance feels empowering. It gives them control over their emotions and the pace of the relationship. They tell themselves that needing less makes them stronger, that detachment is maturity, but what they call strength is really fear disguised as self-protection, and what they call space is often just loneliness wearing a different name. When someone tries to love an avoidant, they often run into invisible walls. They sense the push and pull, the moments of tenderness followed by sudden coldness. It's confusing because the avoidant can be deeply loving in one moment and completely withdrawn in the next. That unpredictability creates emotional instability, not just for their partner, but for themselves. They start to feel disconnected from the very love they desire. The distance they create doesn't actually protect them from pain. It traps them in it. They become spectators in their own relationships, observing connection from afar, but never allowing themselves to fully experience it. Over time, this pattern builds emotional isolation. The avoidant convinces themselves that they're fine alone, that needing others is weakness, but deep down there's an ache they can't silence. The truth is, humans are wired for connection. No amount of rationalizing can change that. Emotional avoidance may delay hurt, but it also delays joy, intimacy, and belonging. The more they withdraw, the less capable they become of recognizing real love when it shows up. Their hearts forget what safety feels like. Meanwhile, their partner begins to feel invisible. They try to understand, to bridge the gap, to offer reassurance. But their effort often feels like pressure to the avoidant. Every attempt to get closer is misinterpreted as an invasion, a threat to autonomy. So the avoidant pushes further away, unaware that in doing so, they're not creating peace, they're creating absence. And absence is not safety, it's silence. Eventually, that silence becomes unbearable. It swallows communication, affection, and trust. When the avoidant finally looks up and realizes they're alone, it's not because love failed them. It's because distance did. The same walls they built to stay safe became their prison. They learned that you can't selectively numb emotions. If you numb pain, you numb joy too. Avoidants often discover this truth when it's too late. When the partner who once reached across the gap finally stops trying, in that moment, the avoidant's greatest fear comes true. Not because someone hurt them, but because they never allowed anyone close enough to stay. Distance may feel like protection, but it always comes at a cost. It isolates the avoidant from the warmth they secretly crave, proving that safety without intimacy isn't peace. It's emptiness masquerading as control. The shift in power in avoidant relationships often happens quietly, almost imperceptibly, until one day it hits like a wave. For so long, the avoidant believes they are in control. They think that by creating distance, by rationing their affection, and by deciding when to show up, they hold the reins. But what they don't realize is that this control exists only because someone else is willing to keep showing up, willing to give, willing to bend themselves around the avoidance patterns in the hope of being seen, understood, and loved. That's the fragile foundation of their power. It's built entirely on the effort of another person, and once that effort stops, their control disappears overnight. At first, the avoidant doesn't notice anything amiss. The silence of the partner who stops chasing, the calm that replaces anxiety, is almost invisible. The avoidant is focused on their own freedom, their own comfort, their own fears. But slowly, the absence of pursuit begins to feel different. It's not threatening in a conventional way, but it's unsettling. The avoidant starts to notice the quiet, the lack of over-explaining, the lack of over-giving. That's when the subtle shift occurs. Power is no longer in the hands of the person who withdraws. It's in the hands of the one who remains composed and self-respecting. The partner who stops chasing is not doing it out of spite. They are simply no longer willing to sacrifice their own peace for someone else's insecurities. They have learned that love cannot be forced. And that emotional manipulation, whether conscious or unconscious, cannot replace genuine connection. This realization is powerful. It takes courage to stop responding to someone who has conditioned you to act, to stop trying to fill the gaps they left behind. The moment the avoidant realizes this, the illusion of control shatters. They thought the relationship could be maintained through absence, distance, or selective engagement. But that strategy no longer works. At this point, the avoidant often feels panic or anxiety. The calm, silent partner becomes the one with power, not because they are aggressive or manipulative, but because they have reclaimed their own emotional agency. The avoidance patterns are exposed as fragile. They cannot maintain the dynamic when faced with true equilibrium. For the first time, they are confronted with the reality that their freedom, which they prize so highly, does not protect them from the consequences of their behavior. They may try to reassert control, but it is often too late. The person who once accommodated the avoidant has stepped out of the cycle. This quiet shift in power teaches an important lesson. True emotional strength doesn't come from running or pushing people away. It comes from self-awareness, from the ability to remain steady, to set boundaries, and to choose presence over fear. The avoidance power is reactive. It relies on others continuing to play the game they have set. When that game ends, the avoidant is left confronting the emptiness their detachment has created. And it is in that emptiness, often for the first time, that they begin to understand what real connection and real power in relationships truly means. Love is not meant to be managed, and yet avoidants often try to do exactly that. They approach relationships like a strategy game, measuring how much to give, when to pull back, and how to maintain their independence without losing affection entirely. They believe that if they ration their love carefully, they can avoid pain, rejection, or vulnerability. The problem is that love is not a resource to be allocated. It is an experience to be shared. Trying to control or manage it destroys the very essence of connection that they secretly crave. The avoidant mistakes detachment for safety and distance for strength, but in reality, love requires risk. It thrives in openness, not in careful calculations or emotional bookkeeping. Avoidants are often terrified of intimacy because they equate closeness with vulnerability. They fear that if they fully give themselves, they will lose control over their own emotions or over the relationship itself. This fear leads them to put up walls, to limit affection, and to create emotional buffers between themselves and their partner. But love does not survive in buffers. It needs presence, attention, and willingness to be seen fully, flaws and all. When an avoidant manages love instead of experiencing it, they inadvertently create a gap that no amount of affection can fill. They may appear to care, but it is superficial care, delivered in controlled portions that never reach the depth their partner desires. The attempt to manage love also creates tension for the partner. They sense the inconsistency, the emotional pull and push, the hesitations and withdrawals that mark the avoidance behavior. This pattern triggers anxiety, confusion, and self-doubt, which the avoidant interprets as further evidence that love is dangerous or burdensome. The cycle perpetuates itself. The avoidant pulls away, the partner chases, the avoidant feels pressured, and the partner becomes more invested. Management replaces spontaneity. Strategy replaces emotional risk, and connection begins to fade. Over time, the avoidant may believe that they are protecting themselves by managing the relationship, but what they are really doing is avoiding the one thing that could save them from loneliness, genuine vulnerability. Love grows when people risk being hurt, when they speak their truths, when they allow themselves to be fully known and still remain committed. Managing love, on the other hand, is an act of control disguised as self-preservation. It is a way to pretend that danger is avoided while simultaneously denying themselves the joy of true closeness. Eventually, the consequences of this approach become clear. The partner who once accommodated the avoidance patterns may stop trying, realizing that no amount of effort can force someone to experience love authentically. When this happens, the avoidant experiences the very fear they sought to avoid, loss. But now it is compounded by regret. The love they tried to manage has slipped away, not because it was insufficient, but because it was never allowed to exist freely. Love cannot be owned, rationed, or controlled. It can only be shared, and avoidance only delays the inevitable realization that connection cannot survive management. The avoidant may think that keeping love at a distance protects them, but the reality is that it isolates them from the very thing they secretly crave. Real love requires presence, courage, and emotional exposure. No amount of management can replace the trust, risk, and intimacy that are the foundation of a meaningful relationship. Attempting to control love does not prevent hurt. It prevents growth, connection, and the deep fulfillment that comes from allowing oneself to be fully alive with another person. The avoidance cycle ultimately ends when self-respect begins, and this is the moment when everything shifts. For a long time, the avoidant may feel in control, believing that the other person's willingness to chase, accommodate, or overgive ensures their dominance in the relationship. They operate under the assumption that love can be managed, measured, and controlled, and they rely on the other person's emotional labor to maintain this illusion. But control built on someone else's compromise is never stable, and it is never real. The power always lies with the person who refuses to sacrifice their own peace for the sake of someone else's comfort. When self-respect becomes the guiding principle, the dynamic changes entirely. The person who once sought approval, explanations, or reassurance begins to stand in their own truth. They stop over-explaining, stop chasing, and stop rationalizing the avoidance behavior. They recognize that love should not feel like a negotiation or a constant test. This is not about manipulation or revenge. It is about acknowledging their own worth and refusing to settle for less than what they deserve. The moment they embody this self-respect, the avoidant's perceived power evaporates. The cycle that relied on their partner's pursuit is broken, and the avoidant is faced with the reality of their own fear, losing the very person they tried to control. Self-respect creates boundaries that the avoidant cannot easily ignore. Boundaries are not walls. They are a declaration that one will not compromise their emotional well-being to maintain the illusion of connection. When a person establishes clear limits around what they will accept, the avoidant strategies of withdrawal, emotional rationing, or subtle manipulation no longer function. The calm, steady presence of someone who honors themselves introduces a stability that the avoidant cannot manufacture. For the first time, the avoidant realizes that control is not something they possess. It is something they attempted to borrow from someone willing to endure uncertainty for their sake. This shift often triggers reflection. The avoidant may experience panic, regret, or confusion, trying to regain the sense of control they thought they had. But the person who has embraced self-respect is no longer available in the same way. They are emotionally sovereign, guided by their own values and priorities. The cycle that once revolved around pursuit and retreat is now replaced with clarity and calm. The avoidant sees, perhaps for the first time, that love cannot be forced or coerced. The one they tried to control has remembered their own value and will not compromise it for the sake of someone else's fear. Ultimately, the cycle ends not through confrontation, argument, or emotional pleading, but through self-realization. The avoidant is left to confront the emptiness their patterns created and the consequences of their own inability to remain present. The partner who once chased is no longer enmeshed in the dance of avoidance. They have chosen themselves. This is the most powerful lesson for anyone involved with an avoidant. The only way to break the cycle is to stop participating in it at the expense of your own dignity. When self-respect becomes the foundation, the avoidance patterns no longer dictate the outcome. They may feel a void, they may reflect, and they may even regret, but the cycle ends because the one they tried to control has chosen their own wholeness over the illusion of connection. At this point, it becomes clear that love is not about control. It is about mutual presence, vulnerability, and respect. The avoidant strategy of management collapses in the face of someone who refuses to compromise their values, who refuses to chase, and who refuses to sacrifice self-worth. When the other person honors themselves, the avoidant cannot continue their cycle. They are left with the stark realization that the person they thought they could control is the one who ultimately holds the power to stay, to leave, and to choose life on their own terms. In the end, the avoidance cycle teaches us a profound truth. Love cannot be controlled, managed, or earned through chasing. It thrives only when we honor ourselves, embrace vulnerability, and allow connection to flow naturally. The moment we stop sacrificing our peace for someone else's fear, the cycle breaks and true power lies in self-respect, clarity, and presence. So to everyone listening, remember that your worth is not measured by someone else's ability to hold on. It is found in the courage to love fully while standing firm in who you are. Thank you for taking the time to reflect, to grow, and to embrace the kind of love that honors both yourself and those around you.